There are only two people who can tell you the truth about yourself: an enemy who has lost his temper, and a friend who loves you dearly. Antisthenes the Cynic. This week on the Dr. Giobbi podcast, we'll be looking at ancient Rome and the Middle Ages, a history of psychology. It wasn't long after Aristotle's death in 322 BCE that the Roman Empire invaded the Greek territories. This had an impact on philosophy, on philosophers and thinking, whereas the ancient Greeks were interested in being and the stuff of reality. And we saw that Socrates and Plato were interested in getting to the essence of reality, of big T truths, and Aristotle was interested in rhetoric and in categorization and what much of natural science is today, as well as with ethics. The ancient Romans, the Roman philosophers, were interested in something new, something we refer to as life philosophy, philosophy for living. And it's not uncommon in times of great technological progress or great political upheaval. Social conditions are uncertain for a lot of self-help books to show up on the shelves. A lot of even religious groups and cults and communities that give one another support and philosophies for living. That's what what Roman philosophy was much about. We're going to look at the Skeptics, the Cynics, the Epicureans, the Stoics, and the Christian Scholastics, and see how philosophy took a turn at this point to being more about life philosophy, a psychology of living in many cases. We can think of the Skeptics as individuals who promoted being critical and suspending belief of the preceding philosophies. The Cynics, on the other hand, were very, as we say, cynical. They retreated from society and were very cautious of cultural norms that were put forth. The Epicureans, in response to the Skeptics and the Cynics, were interested in really living a good life, as we'll see, in living a good balanced life, not a hedonistic life, but a well-balanced life. On the other hand, the Stoics were interested in how emotions affect how we think and act, and how controlling those emotions can help us to think and act in better ways. Much of what we know about skepticism and the Skeptics comes from a 3rd century CE text called Outlines of Pyrrhonism by Sextus Empiricus. Pyrrho of Elis is considered to be the founder of the school of philosophy called Skepticism, but there were no surviving writings or known writings of Pyrrho. We understand the Skeptics as having a severe distaste for dogmatism. Now, a dogmatist is anyone who claims to have arrived at an indisputable truth. So not unlike the sophists, the Skeptics attacked dogmatism, attacked the idea that one proposed that they had come to a big T truth. Apparently, the Skeptics were even skeptical of skepticism. They held that no one at all could know anything at all, and with commendable consistency, they proceeded to deny that they themselves knew even that distressing fact. That appears in Barnes' book in 1982, that quote. So the Skeptics found that the way to a good life, not unlike a Buddhist philosophy, was to give up fighting against these ideologies, against these beliefs, against the appearances of truth. And that one could live a life of quietude, of tranquility, and of imperturbability by giving up taking a strong yes or no dogmatic position. Skeptics did have guiding principles, though, of life, but they weren't set in dogmatic beliefs. They were set in two things: appearances and conventions. So for the skeptics, they made their decisions based on conventions, which was what was the cultural, the social convention guiding a decision, and also appearances. What did they feel? What did they think? So these two guiding forces, appearances and conventions, served as the platform for making decisions in their lives. Listen to how Bertrand Russell described the skeptics. A modern disciple of skepticism would go to church on Sundays and perform the correct genuflection, but without any of the religious beliefs that are supposed to inspire these actions. Ancient skeptics went through the whole pagan ritual, and were even sometimes priests. Their skepticism assured them that this behavior could not be proved wrong, and their common sense assured them that it was convenient. So we do see a very strong connection between the ancient Greek sophists and the Roman skeptics. Antisthenes, who lived from 445 to 365 BCE in Athens, was a student of the sophist Gorgias, and he was also a friend of Socrates. In fact, Plato mentions that Antisthenes was at the death of Socrates. But at some point, Antisthenes became discontented with philosophy. He became disenchanted with much of his upper class life, and he gave it up. He gave up the pursuit of knowledge. He gave up the pursuit of any type of social prestige, and he advocated a self-sufficient quest for simple, independent, natural life. This is the doctrine that became known as cynicism, the Cynics. Let's take a listen to Bertrand Russell's words on cynicism. He would have nothing but simple goodness. He associated with working men and dressed as one of them. He took to open-air preaching in a style that uneducated could understand. All refined philosophy he held to be worthless. What could be known by the plain man. He believed in the return to nature and carried this belief very far. There was to be no government, no private property, no marriage, no established religion. His followers, if not himself, condemned slavery. He despised luxury and all pursuits of artificial pleasures of the senses. A successor to Antisthenes and the Cynics is Diogenes, who lived in 412 to 323 BCE, and where he was critical of was social conventions and what we refer to as social currency. So the ideas of kings and generals, honor, wisdom, happiness, all these type of social currencies, Diogenes rejected. It is said that Diogenes, who liked to spend time as a homeless person on the streets and spending time with animals and anyone, all fellow men, that at one time Alexander the Great approached him, and he was very impressed by Diogenes and asked him if he could do anything for him. And Diogenes replied to Alexander the Great, "Only stand out of my light." And it is said that Diogenes was impressed Alexander quite a bit, and Alexander quoted that, "Had I not been Alexander, I would have liked to have been Diogenes." The word cynic actually means dog-like, and the Cynics argued that one should live like a dog, this simplicity, down-to-earth living. Listen to this quote by Goulet-Cazet. To Diogenes and his disciples, religion seemed to be an obstacle to human happiness, which is why the Cynics considered the state of an irrational creature far preferable to that of men, who suffer the misfortune of having a concept of the gods. The Cynics went as far as saying that even the family structure, the patriarchal family structure, caused ills in society, that we should do away with ideas of guilt and shame and hypocrisy and greed and envy by eliminating the hierarchy based on sex and gender, birth, rank, race, or education. He really lived by the philosophy that nothing natural can be bad. From this philosophy that nothing natural could be bad, Diogenes would fart loudly in crowded places, urinate, masturbate, and defecate in the sight of all, according to Kruger. So Diogenes and the Cynics were reluctant to adhere to any social conventions or to any type of control by social institutions and society. We'll see a great influence from the Cynics on future psychology, existential, phenomenological, and humanist psychology, as well as the philosophers Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Friedrich Nietzsche. Epicurus of Samos, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE, saw the indivisible atom as the ultimate element of existence, of essence, but he didn't see it as lawful. As a matter of fact, he believed it was the basis of all free will. The atoms were free to move about, and he felt that we all had our own free will, our own free choice to move about as we wish. He also saw the basis of life, the basis of reality, as being physical in nature. Rejecting any ideas of a coherent afterlife, Epicurus said that we should look for the good life here while we are alive. His belief was that the postulating of supernatural or afterlife worlds was a way that people coped with the pain of everyday life of the living. But he also put forth a life philosophy, which was an alternative, which instead of believing in a supernatural or an afterworld, would focus on living a good life, the best life possible in this world. Epicurus was called the destroyer of religion by Lucretius. Listen to this quote: "It is not piety for a man to be seen with his head veiled, turning toward stone and drawing near to every altar, or to fall prostrate on the ground, and to stretch out his hands before the shrines of the gods, or sprinkle the altars with copious blood of four-footed beasts, and to add vows to vows, but is rather piety to be able to contemplate all things with a serene mind." Unlike common misconceptions of what Epicureanism is, it was not a hedonistic overabundance of the finer things. As a matter of fact, it was a very simple, down-to-earth life. Listen to Epicurus. "I am thrilled with the pleasure in the body when I live on bread and water, and I spit on luxurious pleasures, not for their own sake, but because of the inconveniences that follow them." So the focus of the Epicureans was not a luxurious, the best of everything, copious life. It was living life in a very practical and simple way and enjoying the senses. If a very expensive or luxury item, if the time and energy invested into maintaining it and obtaining it outweighed the joy that it brought in life, the good life, well, then it wasn't worth the trouble. And so we see here bread and water itself could be the most luxurious of items for the Epicureans. It was an education of the senses. In fact, hedonism was to be avoided. For the Epicureans, the absence of pain was the goal, not the presence of pleasure. The absence of pain, not the presence of pleasure. Epicurus warned, "Sex has never done a man good, and he is lucky if it has not harmed him," and also claimed that the highest form of social pleasure was in fact friendship. Love nothing but that which comes woven to you in the pattern of your destiny. Marcus Aurelius. Hi, today on the Dr. Giobbi podcast, we're continuing episode 3 in the Rome in the Middle Ages with our second part. And we're going to focus today on Stoicism and Neoplatonism in ancient Rome. Zeno of Citium, who lived from 335 to 263 BCE, seems to have had one of the greatest influences on the ancient Romans. Zeno's school of thought is called Stoicism. And the word stoa from Stoicism refers to painted, and this was the nickname given to him because the school that he taught from had a painted porch. Well, it's important to think about the Roman Empire itself. This is an empire that at its height dominated the entire Western world, from the Near East to North Africa to the British Isles, all of Europe. And it has been said that the ancient Greeks were the creators and founders of Western civilization, and the Romans were its builders. The Romans were very pragmatic, very practical individuals. They were interested in engineering. They were interested in solving problems. They were interested in a very practical approaches to even solving the problems of living and thinking. Perhaps one of the easiest ways for us to understand the Stoics today is in the phrase, everything happens for a reason. The Stoics really believed that there was a divine plan. Everything was planned by nature. It all was according to the laws of nature, and whatever happened for a reason, and it must simply be accepted without too much emotional investment. And this is where the idea of stoic comes from, the idea of remaining stoic, just going with it and going with the circumstances with an indifference, and even if there's suffering involved. As Bertrand Russell put it, every man is an actor in a play in which God has assigned the parts. It is our duty to perform our part worthily, whatever it may be. Even in the face of suffering, in the face of receiving the bad lot in life, one must just accept it and go on playing their role in the bigger picture. Stoicism was so popular in ancient Rome that it was embraced by all classes of society. It was embraced by slaves such as Epicurus, and it was embraced by Seneca, the philosopher, and Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome. This was a philosophy that did not find itself existing in just one social class. We find that in Stoicism, material wealth was not prided. Wealth and material objects could be lost, they could be taken away. What was really privileged and sought after was virtue, and was accepting situations that occurred to one in one's life. Listen to Marcus Aurelius's words in Meditations. Work yourself hard. Desire one thing alone, that your actions or inactions alike should be worthy of a reasoning citizen. There was really only one decision to be made, and that is if one was going to cooperate with the bigger scheme, the bigger plan that life and nature had in store. That was the act of free will, deciding how one was going to react to the situations that life brought. In his Meditations, Marcus Aurelius wrote, "To live each day as though one's last, never flustered, never apathetic, never attitudinizing. Here is the perfection of character." Of course, we see much of Christian, if not Protestant, philosophy resonating with this worldview, the idea that one's position is granted in life and they must accept it with humility and grace. This is going to reemerge in the Scholastic and again in Christian philosophy and also in Protestant philosophy. But before we turn to that, let's take a look at another force in ancient Rome, and that is of Neoplatonism. The ancient Romans had a renewed interest in Plato, more in the mystical side of Plato than in the rational side. And they came to be known as the Neoplatonists. And there was a very interesting blending here in ancient Rome between the Jewish tradition and the Platonic traditions. Let's listen to this quote. In spite of the lofty aspirations of Plato and the equally lofty resignation of the Stoic, the literature of the West lacked something, and no Greek could have named its deficiency. It required a temper of a different make. It required a people whose God was jealous and whose faith was a flaming fire. In a word, the Greek had thought about himself until he was indifferent to all things and desperately skeptical. The Hebrew had still the fire of passion and the impetuosity of faith. With these, he made life interesting and fused in one molten mass the attractive elements of every known doctrine. The result was preeminently unintelligible, but it was inspired. The strength of the new influence lay exactly in the strange fervor which must have seemed to the Greek a form of madness. That's from Brett in 1912. Philo, who lived from 25 BCE to CE 50, was known as the Jewish Plato. Philo, taking from Platonic mysticism and from the Hebrew texts, described the body and the soul as being two different things. And he said that one could orient oneself and one's life towards the body, which would be physical pleasures, or towards the soul, which would be godlier or righteous pleasures. And that one could also seek out reality through the body, through the senses, which was faulty, or through the soul, through the spirit or the mind, which was the righteous path. Not unlike Plato's idea of the real forms, the ideal forms, Philo believed that all knowledge came from God, but it was an individual's responsibility to clear themselves of the distraction of the senses and the bodies in order to receive the knowledge from God. Listen to Philo in his own words. Sometimes when I come to my work empty, I have suddenly become full, ideas being in an invisible manner showered upon me and implanted in me from on high, so that through the influence of divine inspiration, I have become greatly excited and have known neither the place in which I was, nor those who were present, nor myself, nor what I was saying, nor what I was writing, for then I have been conscious of a richness of interpretation and enjoyment of light, a most penetrating light, a most manifest energy in all that was to be done, having such an effect on my mind as the clearest ocular demonstration would have on the eye. This idea that knowledge was received from God and not rationally acquired through thought would have been very foreign to the Greek thinkers, but it was a relief to the Romans. It was a relief to the Romans to have some sort of mysticism, or as you recall, some sort of maybe even Dionysian spirit inserted into the more Apollonian Stoicism of the day. A thinker who truly lived and thrived in ancient Rome was Plotness, and his years were 205 to 270 CE. And listen to the words of Russell describing Plotness. He was in harmony with all the most serious men of his age. To all of them, Christians and pagans alike, the world of practical affairs seemed to offer no hope, and only the other world seemed worthy of allegiance. Plotness described a certain hierarchy. We could say at the top of his hierarchy was God, and then came something called the Spirit, And then finally, the human soul. And I think it makes sense if we can understand the soul as the mind. The soul is what created our physical world, what made sense and created meaning in our physical world. But it was inferior to both the spirit and God. We might consider Plotness as being being in accord with Plato's idea that that the physical earth, the physical universe, was in fact inferior to the realm of the ideal forms, but Plotness didn't feel that it had less value because of that. Plotness was very interested in the beauty that could be found in the physical forms. Plotness did see the body as a prison for the soul, and he also taught that, not unlike Christianity would come to teach, that the soul could transcend the body, could transcend the physical prison that the soul was locked in. It was a very easy transition from Neoplatonist Judaism to early Christianity. Both emphasized an afterlife where things would be much better if things weren't so good here. Listen to the words of Russell, Bertrand Russell, in 1945. There is in the mysticism of Plotness nothing morose or hostile to beauty, but he is the last religious teacher for many centuries of whom this can be said. We typically mark the beginning of the Roman Empire with Augustus, year 27 BCE. Rome, known as the Eternal City. The empire lasts for 400 years, and it's not until the Visigoths sacked Rome and the Roman Empire fell, which is typically thought to have completed by September 4th, 476, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was disposed of. Now, the ancient Roman Empire lasted from roughly 27 BCE, with Augustus becoming the first emperor, for about 400 years to 476 CE. So in exactly September 4th, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, gave up power, the invading individual groups, known by the Greek and Latin-speaking world, by the Romans as barbarians, took over and dismantled everything that was the Roman Empire. Romans had conquered most of Europe, and in so doing had severely repressed the cultures of these individuals. And so there was a distaste for anything Roman. An influence came from Persia, from India, Vedantism, of Zoroastrianism, of mystery religions. And they greatly influenced this pre-existing Roman culture with the new cultures of the different German invaders. And we had a time of great mysticism and magical thought. And along with this was the early Christian tradition, Another group of people who lived under Roman rule, the Pax Romana, which we say Roman occupation of their homeland, were the Hebrews, the Jews. And when at this period of time, there were individuals who were rising up as political revolutionaries against the Roman domination. One of these individuals was Jesus, who was born around 6 BCE and died in 30 CE. He was executed by the Romans. And the view that we take of Jesus is a life philosophy based on the fact that he claimed to be a deity. He claimed to have supernatural powers. But he also taught a life philosophy that, of course, continues to be influential today. And we also see him as a political revolutionary. Let's hear Jesus, the political revolutionary, in his own words, addressing a crowd of Jews who are under Roman occupation. Seeing the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you. Hi, welcome to the Dr. Giobbi podcast. Today we're going to be looking at Rome in the Middle Ages, and this is actually part 3 of episode 3 in our series on Rome. And we'll begin today with the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and look specifically at the Scholastics, at Scholasticism. This was the synthesis between Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. So let's take a look now at Rome and the Dark Ages. We usually view the end of the Roman Empire as a specific date, occurring on a specific date, and that's September 4th, 476 CE. And it was the last Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus, and he was disposed by Odoacer, the leader of the Germanic invaders, the Visigoths. And of course, the Visigoths were referred to by the Romans and by the Greeks as barbarians, and it's thought that the language is neither Latin or Greek that the Visigoths spoke came out and sounded like a sort of a bar, and this led the Romans to refer to these people as barbarians. Of course, there's a rich culture here. These were individuals who had their own cultural tradition, their own cultural ways of living, and art and music. And the term barbarian is a very Roman-centric description of these people. Now, in 312, the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity as his religion, and it became eventually the official religion of the Roman Empire. And we find here is a shift in Christianity from being the religion of the oppressed, the belief system of the oppressed, to the belief system of the ruling class. Now, Christianity would now play a very important part in what was left of Rome. Now, the Roman law no longer existed. The Roman Empire was taken over by Germanic tribes, and what we found was little independent towns that usually built walls and around them to protect themselves from other invaders. And the energy was focused on survival, on protecting oneself and one's town from invading forces. There wasn't a lot of time for intellectual pursuits and science and the arts, but there was an elite class of literate individuals, and they were typically the clergy of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. So this period that we refer to as the Dark Ages, really it lasts from somewhere around the year 400 to the year 1000 CE. Now it's interesting to note the role that the Roman Catholic Church played in preserving ancient Greek and Roman philosophy writings and artwork. During this time of individual villages that were constantly under attack and of invading Germanic forces, the works of art, the libraries were destroyed, and to prevent the loss of this rich historical and artistic material, the Roman priests and bishops would take the works of art and the writings and transport them to safe places. Some of those safe places were in Ireland, in caves, and these works of art and these writings were preserved in places like Ireland and also in the Islamic world. It's interesting to note that in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, there was a tremendous renaissance occurring in the world at this time. During the dark ages of the Western world, the Muslim world was experiencing a real explosion in intellectual growth and in cosmology and in science at this time. All that was really known about the ancient Greek philosophy and the Roman philosophy were written in a book by Boethius called The Consolation of Philosophy, and that was Boethius lived from 480 to 525 CE, and this was a very limited knowledge of what was known about the ancient Greek philosophers. So the Christian theologians became very dogmatic at this time in history. Any mention of naturalistic philosophy was viciously attacked, and philosophy and thought and logic was seen to be something that was at the service of the Christian faith. The Roman Church was also very wealthy and powerful at this time. Heretics would be persecuted, and the church was very wealthy. It became a great landowner and had a rather sizable income from penance that were paid by parishioners in lieu of their sinning. Roman Catholic bishops could actually make or break a king. The folks in control were either the Catholic clergy or the wealthy kings and queens, the family lineage. To just show how well organized the Christian church could be towards a cause, between 1095 and 1291, we'll see that there were 8 crusades against Muslims into the Middle Eastern world to stop the spread of Islam. And these were very, very bloody wars, very bloody crusades led by the Roman Catholic Church. It was during these 8 crusades, the Holy Wars against the Islamic world, that Aristotle's works were rediscovered by the West. When Alexander had spread the Greek Empire all over this area of Persia, the works of Aristotle were introduced to the Islamic world. It informed Islamic cosmology, Islamic science, and it existed there long after it was lost and forgotten in the Western Roman Empire. After the reintroduction of Aristotle, it was soon realized by the Catholic theologians that Aristotle needed to be Christianized. And that's exactly what happened in this part of, in this time in history. It was a reconciliation of Christian faith and reason through Aristotle, and it's a period typically known as the Scholastic Period. And the philosophers who did this work, this synthesizing of Christianity and Aristotelian philosophy, were known as the Scholastics. Now, since thinkers like St. Augustine were very influenced by a Platonic philosophy, and this was really a Platonic Christianity, but with the reintroduction of Aristotle into Christianity, into Catholicism, the Scholastics were more interested in logical arguments that would benefit the Christian belief system. At first, Aristotle was embraced by the Christian church. Then they grew very skeptical of his teachings, that it went against Christian dogma, and finally it was synthesized into Christianity. Peter Abelard was a very interesting figure. In addition to translating Aristotle's writings, he also wrote an interesting book called Yes and No. And he introduced what we today know as the dialectical method. This is what we looked at by Hegel, similar to the thesis, antithesis, synthesis model. And in his book, he took 158 arguments that theological arguments, and he investigated each side of them convincingly, taking this dialectical pro and con or yes and no stance full-heartedly on each argument. What he felt was that all means to come to the answers were granted through God. God gave logic, God gave the dialectical method, and that by looking at these issues more closely, we understood them better. During Abelard's time, there was a great debate going on, and that was regarding the idea of universal truth versus relative truth, were ideas such as catness or humanness, or were these universal concepts, or were they nominal concepts? Were these name-induced individual concepts that came into existence on an individual person-by-person basis? And they were actually called either realists or nominalists. Realism was the idea that there was a universal reality, and nominalism or nominalists believed that things came into reality through the way we named them. Now, Abelard got into a debate, actually a very famous debate, with one of the most famous realists of the time, William of Champeaux. And in this debate, Abelard was very skilled, and he showed that in the realist view, that the fallacy that was committed was mistaking words for things. And he said, although logically we can work things out in language, it does not necessarily follow that these things follow these rules in reality, so in the physical objects. So Abelard was very successful in pointing out a fallacy of realism. This concept exists today. We call it reification. This is when we speak of abstract conceptual ideas as if they were real. We talk them into reality. Reification. An example of reification would be the idea of traits. Traits are not real things, they're a theoretical concept, but we've spoken of traits so frequently that we often use the word to refer to something that seems to have some kind of physical substance, some sort of genetic substance, traits. But traits are really descriptive words like adjectives. Now, Abelard came up with a synthesis, and in the words of Radis, listen to this synthesis, it was called Conceptualism. Universals were neither realities nor mere names, but the concepts formed by the intellect when abstracting the similarities between perceived individual things. So the reality that came here, the realism that came, were universally accepted commonalities. They were conceptualizations. Abelard went on to start his own school, and he became a very famous teacher. His students affectionately called him Master Peter. Listen to his description from Luddy, 1947. His eloquence, wit, and power of luminous exposition, his magnificent voice, noble bearing, and beauty of face and figure, his boldness in criticizing the most venerable authorities, and attempting a natural solution of the mysteries of faith, all combined to make him beyond comparison the most popular teacher of his age. It is said that in his school that the other professors' lecture halls were empty, while Master Peter's lecture halls were full. When Abelard was 42 years old, he was hired by someone to move into their house and teach privately a 17-year-old girl named Heloise. Now, listen to how Abelard described the relationship. With our lessons as a pretext, we abandoned ourselves entirely to love. Her studies allowed us to withdraw in private as love desired, and then with our books open before us, more words of love than our reading passed between us, and more kissing than teaching. My hands strayed oftener to her bosoms than onto the page. Love drew our eyes to look on each other more than reading kept them on our texts. To avert suspicion, I sometimes struck her, but these blows were prompted by love and tender feeling rather than anger and irritation, and were sweeter than any balm could be. In short, our desires left no stage of love-making untried, and if love could devise something new, we welcomed it. We entered on each joy the more eagerly for our previous inexperience and were the less easily sated. Now, just when it was becoming interesting, it turns in another twist. Abelard was found out by Heloise's uncle and asked to leave the house. He was kicked out of the house, but Heloise became pregnant and was very much in love with Abelard. Listen to what she said. God is my witness that if Augustus, emperor of the whole world, thought fit to honor me with marriage and conferred all the earth on me to possess forever, it would be dearer and more honorable to me to be called not his empress, but your whore. Now, she really loved him. They were very much in love, and he wanted to remain in the church. So they were secretly married, and then the marriage was hidden, and apparently he dressed her in a nun's habit and brought her to the convent where she lived, and he would visit her. It turns out that the uncle really got his revenge because, according to Abelard, one night while he was sleeping, the uncle hired some guys to go into his lodgings and apparently cut off his genitals. Now, the two thugs who did this were caught, and they were blinded and castrated themselves. Abelard became a monk, Heloise became a nun, and they wrote spicy love letters to one another. Now, another scholastic figure was St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas grew up very wealthy. He grew up in a castle. When he became an adult, he left the castle and joined the Dominican order. He went on the streets and begged for money and food. His family saw this and were very upset, and they kidnapped him and imprisoned him in their castle for about a year, and even tried to seduce him with prostitutes and things of this nature. He refused this. They eventually let him go, and he returned to the Dominicans. He received his Ph.D. in Theology from the University of Paris at the age of 31, which was about 3 years earlier than was typically permitted for someone to be granted the Ph.D. in Theology. And he then went on to really be the synthesizer of Aristotelian philosophy with Christianity. When we think scholastics and Aristotle, we typically think of St. Thomas Aquinas. So we have Christianity, which taught that truth was acquired through revelation and through faith. And we have Aristotle, who felt that truth was arrived at through logic and reason and natural observation. Now, here is Aquinas' great achievement in synthesizing Christianity with Aristotelian theory. He went on to use Aristotelian philosophy to show that logic would end up at the same place as faith, revelation, and inspiration, that this was just another method of God to lead to the truth. Now, this reorienting or reintroduction of Aristotle into thinking and its synthesis with Christianity brought more of an earthiness, an earthliness to Christianity, a realism. And this really would help to usher in what's about to happen in the 1400s, which is the Renaissance, a return to a more earth-centered philosophy and worldview. Now, the individual that really we consider to be the turning point from the Middle Ages, from the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, is William of Occam. William of Occam was a British-born Franciscan monk, and he was very intrigued by Aquinas' division of faith and reason, and he chose reason over faith. He believed that when we were theorizing, when we were thinking about things, that we should make it as simple as possible. No unnecessary assumptions should have to be made. In other words, the most basic, the simplest explanation was always the one you should go with. He spoke briefly of assumptions being limited. the assumption we make when thinking theoretically should be limited, they should be shaved off, and this came to be known as Occam's Razor. So we can think of Occam as a super empiricist, almost like a contemporary positivist. If Aristotle said that we must take sensory experience and then reason to think through it to using reason, Occam said all we need is sensory experience. He was a realist. He was what we would today call in science a positivist. But as we'll see, Aristotle's introduction into Christianity started to chip away. People started to become more and more interested in logic and reason than in faith. And this would set the stage for the upcoming event of the rebirth, the Renaissance.